Well, I'm Dale Strickland. I'm the senior ecologist and president of the company. I've been involved in wind wildlife issues for a long time, 15 to 20 years. There were questions about the Federal Advisory Committee this morning. I'm a technical advisor to that committee, and so I could answer questions about that later if you choose to ask me about that issue. So my primary goal here is to go over the basic impacts that we know of, give you the evidence we have, impacts on wildlife from wind development. Okay, so the basic issues are avian mortality, loss of habitat, bat mortality, and threatened and endangered species issues. Threatened and endangered species protected under the Endangered Species Act. So avian mortality can occur from a lot of different sources, wind turbines being one of them, net tower collisions, power line collisions, vehicle collisions. If you feed birds, you probably, in the last few years, found a dead bird or two around your house because birds fly into windows. Big cities, lots of birds fly into tall buildings that are lit at nighttime. So there are a lot of reasons for avian fatalities. In summarizing the data, we've divided the country up into several different groupings of states. There's no particular significance to the combination other than it was just a convenient way for us to organize the data, and this would, the Northeast would include what I think you've termed mid-Atlantic, as well as the further northeast part of the country, and Virginia is part of that. So raptors, and that's birds of prey, hawks, eagles, owls, they are of particular concern when it comes to fatalities at wind facilities. So we've separated raptors out from all birds. And there's a similar pattern in every region, but you'll notice that the highest raptor fatalities are in the West. And these two facilities are both in California. So the wind facilities in California occur in open space, and the remaining raptor habitat in California is also an open space. So just the land use issue kind of forces those species, or the species together with the wind facilities. These are modern facilities. I don't have the Altamont Pass data in here because Altamont Pass is such a different development. So this is modern facilities. And so the nationwide average is 0.12 fatalities per megawatt per study period. And this megawatt is the nameplate megawattage. So if you're familiar with that, it's what a turbine under perfect conditions would produce. It doesn't necessarily relate to what's actually produced, but it's the nameplate. So it's like a 1.5 or 2.5 megawatt turbine. That's the nameplate capacity of that turbine. The East has some raptor fatalities. 0.5 is the highest value for the East, I believe. That's a site in New York. And fatalities vary. Well, I've got a slide that addresses the distribution of species. And all birds include passerines. Passerines are migrating songbirds, are the most common species found as fatalities in our studies. And there is a very similar pattern in every region. There are a few sites that have relatively high fatality rates, above 6 per megawatt per study period. But every region have low numbers. We're not sure why. Regarding raptor fatalities, it seems like the more raptors you have in an area, the higher the fatality rate. With passerines, it's not that clear. And so I really can't say why this pattern exists, but it's more than likely related to use and the habitat that exists in the area. You'll notice there's one sort of what I call an outlier, and that's Buffalo Mountain, Tennessee. This is an estimate made at a facility that had 3 turbines. And so that has been for years the highest fatality rate for total birds for any facility in the country, and it's a ridgetop facility in the northeastern Tennessee. So we didn't know whether this was an anomaly, whether it was that site was unique for some reason, but the data point was just there. Well, fairly recently that site was expanded, and we now have another data point from the same facility, an expanded, larger facility, and that data point is back down within the range of the rest of the facilities in the east. So our guess is this is a sampling error. We're not sure, but based on the evidence at the newer, expanded facility, more than likely this is sampling error. So you can see that the pattern of fatalities per megawatt per year are not a lot different in the Northeast than they are in the upper Midwest and in the West, which is a little bit surprising because one would assume that there are more passerines in the Northeast than in some of these other regions. Okay, so songbirds, we have a mixture of resident and nocturnal migrating songbirds, so when you find dead songbirds, it's difficult to tell for sure whether they're migrating or resident. But if you find a species that you know doesn't nest in a particular area, dead at the turbine, normally we expect that to be a migrant. So these are approximate evaluations without real quantitative data on residents. There have been no large mortality events. I think the highest mortality event that we've seen is something like 12 birds at 2 turbines over one night period at Buffalo Ridge, Minnesota. Nothing like the fatality events you hear about at communications tunnels. Upland game birds show up, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. Those are mostly pheasants, and more than likely, a lot of those fatalities are non-turbine related. But when we do our surveys, we make the conservative assumption that everything we find in a plot below a turbine is turbine caused. But there's evidence that they've perhaps been hit by cars, caught by predators and those kind of things, but we put them in the data set anyway. American kestrels, red-tailed hawks, golden eagles are the primary raptors that are killed. There's some evidence that these 3 species here are more susceptible to collisions than other raptor species. Some raptor species, it's sort of logical if you understand their life history. Marsh hawks, for example, tend to fly very low to the ground most of the time, so they don't fly through the rotor-swept area, even though they're fairly common in some facilities. Eagles, golden eagles, red-tailed hawks, and American kestrels spend a lot of time flying in the rotor-swept area, so that's probably the reason. There are a number of facilities that have been constructed in areas where there are lots of waterfowl, but there haven't been a lot of waterfowl found as fatalities at wind facilities, and ravens and turkey vultures often occur in fairly large numbers at wind facilities, and yet we don't find them in the fatality data very often. We believe it's a difference in behavior.
A question on kestrels, red-tailed hawks, and golden eagles. Was your suggestion that they spend a lot of time gliding and such and hunting at the elevation where the windswept rotor occurs rather than descending through it or something like that?
Yeah, more or less. Eagles, for example, spend a lot of time coursing along ridge lines, using the thermal currents while they look for prey, and when they see the prey, the assumption is that they kind of get tunnel vision and just scoop on the prey, and it's during these really focused events when the fatalities occur. And so their hunting behavior is similar to red-tailed hawks, and so they are more likely, they have the behavior that's going to put them at more risk. Kestrels, I think, probably relates to there's a lot more kestrels than most other raptors, and so that's probably not so much a behavioral thing, it's just an abundance thing. So if you look at the composition of fatalities throughout the entire country, you'll see this blue area here. 74% of all the fatalities found are passerines. If you think about the abundance of passerines relative to all these other species, it's not surprising. There are millions and millions, hundreds of millions of passerines, and yet there aren't nearly that many raptors, for example. So it's not, it doesn't say anything about the risk. It just simply says that when we count up the bodies, the passerines are the largest group. Here's the game birds that I mentioned before, and raptors, I believe, is the 6% nationwide. So this 6% is that number represents a higher percentage of the number of raptors exposed to risk than the passerines. If we break that out down into region, I'll focus on the northeast or the east region. In this case, as we would expect, there are more passerines in the east than in the west, and so the percentage of fatalities is a little bit higher in the east in terms of passerines. And it's not surprising that you don't have very many ring-necked pheasants still in the east. But raptors are still one of the larger groups, even though it's a fairly small group. One of the things that we found in looking at when fatalities occur, raptors tend to occur throughout the year. There's not a real clear pattern of fatalities. There's a few more fatalities in the fall during the migration period, but it's not a statistically significant change. However, if you look at the small birds, it appears that small birds are killed more often during the spring and fall migrations. So now focus a little bit more on the northeastern studies and the results. There are a couple in West Virginia in our database, Pennsylvania, quite a few in New York, a couple in Maine. And I should say a little bit about how we go about selecting data to include in this data set. We look for studies